Hello there, my name is Elizabeth McDaniel. This is my final presentation for Human Physiology 2 with Dr. Waller at Grand Canyon University. And this one is all about the fluid compartments in the body, what ionic constituents are within them, and also how they are regulated. We all remember probably from elementary school science that the human body is made up mostly of water, and we've been told to hydrate for this reason, especially when we're outdoors on exceptionally hot days and when we're exercising. And it's true, the human body is composed of approximately 60% water, ranging from 40 to 80%. This differs on sex and age as well. Infants have a higher body fluid percentage than the elderly, and generally men have a higher water percentage than women. Our plasma is composed of more than 90% water. Our skin, muscles, and organs between 70 to 80%. Our bones are much drier, made up of about 20% water. And adipose or fat tissue is the driest of all at around 10% water. The balance of not only water, but the concentrations of the ionic compounds within the fluid in our bodies is regulated carefully because cells can only function within a narrow range of ionic concentrations. So maintaining balance requires control of both volume and osmolarity and is primarily controlled by the kidneys, which regulate salt concentration as well as acid-base concentrations by adjusting the hydrogen ion and bicarbonate excretion. Our extracellular fluid serves as a kind of bank or internal pool for ionic and fluid substances, which may be drawn from or deposited into when necessary, but mostly maintaining fluid stability requires that output via excretion or metabolic consumption equals input via ingestion or production in the body of those ionic compounds such as salt, so that all of the body's systems perform as they should. So where exactly is all this fluid in the body? Well, there are two major compartments which contain almost all of the water in our systems. And these consist of intracellular fluid, which makes up 2/3 of all the water in the body. And this is the fluid inside the body's cells, which is enclosed within the cellular membrane. And the second is extracellular fluid, which, as its name implies, is everything outside of the cell. Extracellular fluid makes up about 1/3 of body fluid, and it can be further subdivided into interstitial fluid and plasma. The interstitial fluid makes up 80% of that extracellular fluid. This is the fluid that surrounds or bathes all of the cells within the body's tissues. And the remaining 20% is plasma, which exists within the capillaries and blood vessels. Now, there are other classified fluid compartments within the body which are technically extracellular fluids, such as the lymph, the cerebrospinal fluid, ocular fluid in our eyes, synovial fluid in our joints, the pericardial fluid surrounding the heart, the intrapleural fluid in our lungs, and peritoneal or digestive fluid in our digestive tract. But these fluids are generally much more stable and represent such a tiny fraction of total body fluids, so they're not usually considered in the discussion of fluids as they pertain to ion balance and reabsorption or excretion. The only exception is when severe gastrointestinal illness knocks off the ionic concentration balance due to dehydration. So in this image here to my left, you can see a couple of cells. We'll circle them. Here and here. These are bathed in the interstitial fluid, and below them is this blood vessel. The nature of the ionic compound composition within these structures depends on the membranes or the walls that separate them. So the cell membrane is selectively permeable, and it contains many channels and porin proteins that allow specific ions to cross over. So for that reason, the constituent ions within the intracellular fluid are much different from the extracellular fluid. And in contrast to that, the interstitial fluid and plasma are very similar because blood vessel walls allow for free exchange of almost every ion with the exception of plasma proteins and blood cells. Now let's look at the ionic composition of these fluids a little more closely. And here is a neat little chart showing the major ions in these three compartments. So notice that each of these is electrically balanced, meaning it has the same amount of positively charged ions as negatively charged ions. The plasma has a large concentration of sodium. Look at all that sodium. Just a little bit of potassium, and is balanced out by chloride anions and bicarbonate. And there's also some negatively charged proteins. So since the interstitial fluid is only separated from the plasma by that highly permeable capillary wall, the plasma and interstitial fluid are almost identical, with the interstitial fluid containing a large amount of sodium, a little bit of potassium, some bicarbonate, and a lot of chloride. Except that the interstitial fluid is missing those protein anions. And this is because plasma proteins are too large to fit through the capillary membrane, and I'm grateful for that. And finally, we have the intracellular fluid, which, as you can see, is a whole lot different from the extracellular fluids. We have over here just a little bit of positively charged sodium, but it's mostly potassium inside the cell. This is due to a special membrane-bound pump called the sodium-potassium or Na+K+ pump, which actively transports sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. Also, within that intracellular fluid, there is a considerable amount of phosphate anion, and there are quite a lot of negatively charged proteins as well. So just to sum all of this up, the major differences between the intracellular fluid and extracellular fluid are that cell proteins in the intracellular fluid cannot permeate the cell membrane, and there's also an unequal distribution of sodium and potassium cations and their accompanying anions due to that sodium-potassium pump in the cell membrane. Also, the extracellular fluid and osmolarity has to be carefully regulated to maintain blood pressure and to prevent swelling or shrinking of the cells. And I'm going to talk about that next. And lastly, I just want to touch on the maintenance of all these ions within fluid compartments. So water movement across the membrane is controlled by imbalances in capillary blood pressure and colloid osmotic pressure. There are also the hydrostatic pressures of interstitial fluid and intracellular fluid, which stay relatively low and fairly constant. Also, plasma can be acted on directly to control volume and composition, and this in turn regulates interstitial fluid, which then regulates the intracellular fluid. So the volume and osmolarity of the extracellular fluid must be closely regulated to maintain blood pressure. And in order to maintain the osmolarity and the volume of these fluids, the human body has both long-term and short-term compensatory measures. So first and foremost, our kidneys regulate the urinary output along with our thirst mechanism. That's in the hypothalamus. Kidneys actively conserve salt, and because water follows salt, this conserves water. Any excess sodium must be excreted, and this is done through either sweat or feces or urine. Usually humans consume excess sodium, much more than we need. But when it does need to be preserved, the kidneys will adjust the glomerular filtration rate, or GFR, as well as the tubular reabsorption of sodium through the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to promote reabsorption of sodium. When a quick response to fluid and ionic alterations is needed, there are also some short-term responses. The first one is the baroreceptor reflex, which works through the sympathetic nervous system to alter our cardiac output, making our heart beat faster and harder, and peripheral resistance, so that when our blood pressure is too low, this will bring our blood pressure up. Also, the natural tendency of water to move across a membrane from a higher concentration to a lower concentration causes automatic shifts in hydrostatic pressure to accommodate the body's needs. For example, when plasma volume is too low, the fluid will move into the plasma from the interstitial compartment, and when plasma volume is too high, water will naturally shift into the interstitial compartment. Pretty cool. As usual, I get all my pictures from the internet, so here are my sources. Thank you.